The first thing Vanessa Cole did after Richard Whitman's funeral was smile, and that was the moment Margaret Hayes knew the woman had mistaken a coffin for a crown. It was a small smile, almost invisible beneath the black net veil pinned over Vanessa's perfectly styled blonde hair. But Margaret saw it from the third pew, because lawyers who spend 30 years watching families tear each other apart over money learn to notice the tiny movements people think grief will hide. The church in Greenwich, Connecticut, was filled with white roses, polished mahogany, and the kind of old money silence that made even a cough sound like an accusation. Outside, a gray November rain tapped against the stained glass windows. Inside, Richard Whitman's portrait stood near the altar, younger than he had looked at the end, handsome in the cruel, effortless way that had opened doors for him long before he earned the right to walk through them. Vanessa stood beside the closed casket in a tailored black dress, one hand resting over the diamond ring he had given her 2 years before, the other accepting condolences with the careful softness of a woman performing sorrow for an audience that still mattered. "You were his whole world," someone whispered as they embraced her. Vanessa lowered her eyes, pressed a silk handkerchief to the corner of one dry eye, and murmured, "Thank you." Richard would have wanted dignity today. Margaret nearly laughed, which would have been inappropriate, though not entirely undeserved. Dignity had not been one of Richard Whitman's more consistent habits. He had built Whitman Logistics from 3 delivery trucks and a borrowed office into a company valued at more than $80 million. But he had also built a private life full of locked drawers, delayed truths, and people he found easier to abandon than explain. Vanessa, however, seemed determined to remember only the version of him that had come with beachfront vacations, charity galas, and a mansion with 8 bedrooms she had already begun calling the house instead of Richard's house. Near the front, Richard's older sister, Caroline, sat stiffly beside 2 board members, her mouth pressed into a line so thin it looked drawn with a ruler. No one mentioned Claire Whitman. No one mentioned the first wife. No one mentioned the woman who had once helped Richard answer customer calls at midnight, balanced invoices at their kitchen table, and believed his promises back when ambition still sounded like hope instead of warning. And no one, most carefully of all, mentioned the twins. Vanessa moved through the reception hall afterward like a widow accepting a throne. She let people kiss her cheek. She let them call her Mrs. Whitman. She let them speak of Richard's legacy as though legacy were only buildings, bank accounts, and framed magazine covers. When a country club acquaintance leaned close and said, "At least he left everything in capable hands," Vanessa's smile returned, warmer this time, more certain. Across the room, Margaret Hayes closed her leather folder with a quiet snap. In that folder was a sealed envelope Richard had signed 3 weeks before his death. Inside the envelope was a will Vanessa had never seen, a trust document she had never suspected, and one sentence written in Richard's own hand that would soon turn that little funeral smile into something colder than fear. "Bring Claire. Bring the children. They deserve my name in a courtroom, not as a rumor." 48 hours later, Vanessa Cole would sit in probate court wearing the same black pearls, expecting to inherit a kingdom. Then the doors would open, and 2 7-year-old children would walk in holding their mother's hands. Claire Whitman did not attend Richard's funeral because no one had told her there would be one until the flowers were already wilting. She learned about his death from a forwarded obituary that arrived in her email on a Tuesday morning while Ethan was looking for his left sneaker and Emily was standing at the kitchen counter, carefully pouring cereal into 3 bowls as if breakfast were a ceremony that could keep the world from falling apart. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of an old brick building in Providence, Rhode Island, the kind with radiators that hissed too loudly in winter and windows that never quite sealed against the wind. It was not the life Claire had imagined when she married Richard Whitman at 26, wearing her grandmother's pearls and believing that love, hard work, and loyalty were enough to build something permanent. Back then, Richard had not been a name printed on donor walls or whispered in country clubs. He had been a restless young man with a dented pickup truck, a borrowed desk, and a dream so large it seemed to take up every room they entered. Claire had answered phones when the first drivers called in sick. She had created invoices on a laptop that overheated if it was not propped on a stack of books. She had packed lunches, balanced accounts, calmed angry clients, and told Richard he was brilliant on the nights when he was terrified he was not. For years, Whitman Logistics had been less a company than a third person in their marriage, always hungry, always demanding, always allowed to come first. Then the money arrived, and with it came the board dinners, the new suits, the house in Greenwich, and the strange vanishing of the man who used to kiss her forehead over coffee at midnight. Vanessa Cole entered their life first as Richard's public relations consultant, polished and bright as a showroom window, with perfect posture and a talent for making ambition sound like destiny. Claire noticed the way Richard changed around her. His voice became sharper. His patience shortened. He began calling Claire practical in the same tone other men used for plain. When the twins were born, tiny and early and fighting for every ounce, Richard stayed at the hospital for photographs, then returned to a meeting in New York because a client from Dallas was flying in. He said he was building their future. Claire believed him because belief was easier than admitting she was becoming invisible. By the time Ethan and Emily were 2, Richard had moved into a penthouse during the week and called it necessary for business. By the time they were 3, Vanessa was appearing beside him in society photographs, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile bright enough to erase the woman who had stood beside him when there had been nothing to photograph. The divorce papers arrived in a cream envelope on a Friday afternoon. Richard's lawyers described Claire as emotionally overwhelmed, financially dependent, and resistant to reasonable settlement terms. It was astonishing how quickly a wife could become an inconvenience once a man had enough money to hire people to rename his guilt. Claire signed what she could, fought where she had strength, and lost more than she could explain to 2 children who only wanted to know why Daddy stopped calling on Sundays. 7 years passed. She built a smaller life from the pieces he left behind. Freelance bookkeeping, school pickups, library afternoons, birthday cupcakes made from boxed mix because the bakery charged too much. She never told the twins their father did not love them. She only said grown-ups sometimes make choices they are not brave enough to explain. But on the morning she saw Richard's obituary, Claire sat down at the kitchen table with one hand over her mouth and the other pressed flat against the unpaid electric bill, feeling nothing at first except the strange silence of a door closing forever. Ethan looked up from tying his sneaker and asked, "Mom, is something wrong?" Claire looked at her son's blue eyes, Richard's eyes, set in a face too innocent to understand inheritance, abandonment, or the cruel little ways adults pretend blood can be edited out of a story. She folded the obituary, slipped it beneath a stack of mail, and said, "We are going to be okay." She had no idea that, 2 days later, a legal envelope would arrive with Richard's handwriting inside it, and for the first time in 7 years, he would ask her not to disappear. The envelope arrived on Thursday afternoon, carried by a courier in a navy raincoat who looked too young to understand that sometimes a single piece of paper can reopen an entire life. Claire had just returned from Lincoln Elementary with Ethan and Emily, both children damp from a sudden shower and arguing softly about whether hot chocolate counted as an after-school snack or a dessert. The apartment smelled of wet wool, pencil shavings, and the tomato soup Claire had left warming on the stove. It was ordinary in the fragile way ordinary things become precious when a family has learned not to expect much from the world. The knock came just as Emily was lining her library books along the coffee table by size. Claire opened the door with a dish towel in one hand, and the courier asked for her signature. The return address made her fingers tighten around the pen. Hayes and Whitcomb, attorneys at law, Greenwich, Connecticut. For a moment, the hallway seemed to tilt. She knew that name. Margaret Hayes had been Richard's family attorney long before Vanessa, long before the divorce, long before Claire learned that wealthy families did not need to shout when they wanted someone erased. They simply hired people who knew which words to use. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and expensive, the kind of paper Richard used to choose for invitations to events where Claire had once stood beside him smiling until her cheeks hurt. She thanked the courier, closed the door, and stood there with her back against it while the twins watched her from the living room. "Is it bad mail?" Ethan asked, because children who grow up around overdue bills become experts at reading silence. Claire forced a small smile. "I do not know yet." She waited until they were at the kitchen table with mugs of hot chocolate, because apparently mankind had survived worse definitions of dessert, then carried the envelope to the counter and opened it with a butter knife. Inside was a formal notice requesting her appearance at the Fairfield County Probate Court the following morning for the reading and certification of Richard Allen Whitman's final will and testament. Beneath it was a smaller sealed card, folded once. Claire recognized the handwriting before she saw the name. Richard had always written in a sharp, slanted script, as if even his letters were trying to get somewhere before everyone else. Her breath caught. She unfolded the card slowly. Claire, bring Ethan and Emily. They deserve to hear the truth from my own name. I should have done this while I could still look them in the eyes. The room went silent around her, though nothing had actually stopped. The radiator still hissed. Rain still tapped the window. Emily still stirred her hot chocolate with the careful focus of a child trying not to seem curious. But Claire felt as if the past had stepped through the wall and placed a hand on her shoulder. She read the words once, then again, searching for cruelty, manipulation, some final trick dressed as regret. Richard had been gifted at regret when it cost him nothing. He could apologize beautifully and change nothing at all. But this was different. This was not a bouquet after a fight or a late check with a vague excuse. This was a legal summons. This was his handwriting attached to a courtroom. This was a door he had locked for 7 years, suddenly opening from the other side. Claire sat down because her knees had begun to feel unreliable. Ethan slid from his chair and came to stand beside her. He did not ask whether his father was dead. He knew enough now to understand that some questions changed the air in a room. Emily climbed down too and leaned against Claire's arm, her small hand finding the edge of the card. "Do we have to go?" she whispered. Claire looked at both of them, at Ethan's serious blue eyes and Emily's stubborn little chin, both echoes of a man who had given them blood but withheld presence. Every protective instinct in her body wanted to say no. She wanted to keep them in their small, warm kitchen, away from polished courtrooms, cold glances, and adults who could turn children into evidence without even lowering their voices. But then she saw the sentence again. They deserved to hear the truth. Claire had spent years softening Richard's absence so it would not cut them too deeply. Maybe she had been wrong to think softness was the same as protection. Maybe the truth, handled carefully, could be a kind of shelter too. She folded the card, placed it back on the table, and took one hand from each child. "We are going," she said quietly. "Not because of money. Not because of him. We are going because your names belong in that room." That night, after the twins were asleep, Claire took out the small metal box from the back of her closet. Inside were their birth certificates, old photographs, hospital bracelets, canceled checks, and every letter Richard had sent and failed to follow with action. She laid them across the kitchen table beneath the yellow light, not like weapons, but like proof that her children had existed even when powerful people found their existence inconvenient. By midnight, her old black dress was hanging on the closet door, freshly steamed. By dawn, she had packed snacks, tissues, and 2 sweaters because courtrooms were always colder than they needed to be, another charming human invention. And by 8 o'clock the next morning, Claire Whitman was driving toward Greenwich with Ethan and Emily in the back seat, unaware that Vanessa Cole was already standing before a mirror, fastening pearls around her throat, as if she were preparing to receive everything Richard had left behind. Vanessa Cole believed there were certain rooms a woman entered only after she had already won, and the marble bathroom of the Whitman mansion had become one of them. She stood before the oval mirror beneath a row of soft gold lights, fastening a strand of pearls around her throat with hands that did not tremble. The house around her was quiet in the expensive way only very large houses could be quiet. All polished floors, heavy drapes, and rooms designed more for admiration than comfort. Outside the tall windows, the lawns were silver with morning rain, and beyond the hedges, the long driveway curved toward the iron gates like a private road into a life Claire Whitman had once been forced to leave behind. Vanessa tilted her chin and studied herself. Black dress, perfect. Pearls, appropriate. Diamond ring, visible. Grief, convincing enough. She had learned early that appearances did not need to be true to become useful. Richard had loved that about her in the beginning, or at least he had admired it, which in Richard's world often passed for love when properly lit and served with champagne. She knew how to stand beside powerful men without looking like decoration. She knew when to speak, when to laugh, when to touch an arm lightly, when to let silence suggest loyalty. Claire, from what Vanessa had gathered over the years, had been different. Earnest, Practical. Too soft around the edges. The kind of woman who believed helping a man build his empire meant she would be remembered. When the empire finally had gates, Vanessa almost pitied her, in the abstract, the way one might pity someone who brought handwritten notes to a negotiation. On the vanity lay a folder from her own attorney, Martin Keller, a silver-haired man who charged $600 an hour and smiled as though every sentence had been notarized. He had assured her that surviving spouses were not easily displaced. He had reminded her that Richard had updated several estate documents after the marriage. He had told her the first wife might appear, but appearances were not the same as claims. Vanessa liked that sentence enough to repeat it while applying lipstick. Appearances are not claims. It sounded clean, legal, final. Her phone buzzed beside the sink. A message from Martin appeared across the screen. Probate hearing at 10. Arrive composed. Let me handle any surprises. Vanessa smiled again. Men were always telling women to remain composed, usually right before proving they had underestimated the room. She slipped the phone into her handbag and walked downstairs, passing the formal dining room where Richard had hosted investors, politicians, and the kind of charity committees that made generosity look like a tax strategy with flowers. On the sideboard sat a framed photograph from last year's hospital gala. Richard in a tuxedo, Vanessa in midnight blue silk, both of them smiling beneath a banner with the Whitman Foundation logo. She paused before it. That night, a donor had asked whether Richard had children. Vanessa remembered how Richard's jaw tightened for half a second before he said, "Not in any meaningful sense." At the time, she had considered the answer convenient. Now, standing in the house the morning after his burial, she considered it protective. He had chosen the life that mattered. He had chosen her. At least that was the story she needed the world to keep believing. By 9:15, the Blacktown car was waiting beneath the portico. Martin Keller stood beside it, holding an umbrella, his gray overcoat buttoned neatly over a charcoal suit. "You look exactly as you should," he said. Vanessa accepted the compliment as confirmation, not kindness. "Will Claire be there?" she asked. Martin's expression barely changed. She was notified. With the children? Possibly. Vanessa looked toward the wet driveway, her smile thinning. "This is a legal matter, not a school field trip." Martin gave a small, practiced nod. "If they appear, we acknowledge them respectfully and keep the focus on the documents." Respectfully. Another useful word people used when they wanted uglier feelings to wear gloves. Vanessa stepped into the car and settled against the leather seat as the mansion receded behind her. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the afternoon ahead. The will certified, the accounts transferred, the board reassured, the house fully hers. The last loose threads of Richard's previous life folded away into a file no one important would open again. By the time the car reached the courthouse in downtown Greenwich, the rain had softened into mist. Vanessa walked through the courthouse doors with Martin at her side, her heels clicking against the stone floor in a steady rhythm. People turned. Some recognized her. Some whispered. She kept her eyes forward, wearing grief like a tailored coat. In the probate courtroom, she took the front seat, placed her handbag on her lap, and looked toward Margaret Hayes, who sat at the counsel table with a sealed envelope in front of her. Margaret did not smile. That should have warned Vanessa. Instead, Vanessa looked at the empty seats behind her and mistook absence for victory. Judge Eleanor Brooks entered the courtroom at exactly 10 o'clock, which seemed appropriate for a woman whose very posture suggested she believed clocks, people, and entire families should behave themselves. Everyone rose. Vanessa rose too, smoothing the front of her black dress as though order could be restored by fabric alone. Claire was not there yet. The empty row behind Vanessa remained empty, and with each passing second, Vanessa's confidence settled deeper into her bones. The courtroom was smaller than she had expected, not the grand stage of television dramas, but a solemn room of dark wood, beige walls, fluorescent lights, and old air that smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and rain-soaked coats. Still, it had its own power. It was the kind of room where whispers became records and private mistakes learned to sit upright. Margaret Hayes stood at the counsel table, her silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her leather folder placed precisely beside the sealed envelope. Martin Keller sat next to Vanessa with his pen aligned perfectly with his legal pad. Across the aisle were Richard's sister Caroline, two executives from Whitman Logistics, and a distant cousin Vanessa had met twice and disliked both times. Judge Brooks adjusted her glasses and looked over the file. We are here regarding the estate of Richard Allen Whitman, deceased, including the certification of his final will and testament and related trust documents. Vanessa lowered her eyes at the word deceased, not out of grief exactly, but because grief looked best when it arrived on cue. Margaret's voice was calm when she confirmed her appearance as counsel for the estate. Martin confirmed his appearance on behalf of the surviving spouse. The phrase pleased Vanessa. Surviving spouse. It sounded official, almost musical. A title wrapped in law. Judge Brooks reviewed the preliminary filings, the death certificate, the marriage record, the estate inventory, and the notice requirements. The numbers, when spoken aloud, seemed to warm the room around Vanessa. The Greenwich residence, the Nantucket property, investment accounts, majority ownership in Whitman Logistics, charitable holdings, a private trust, personal assets valued in the millions. Each item landed like a brick in the foundation of the future she had already designed. Then the judge paused, her finger resting on a page. Ms. Hayes, before the court proceeds to the reading of the testamentary provisions, I need clarification regarding biological heirs. Vanessa's hand tightened around the clasp of her handbag. It was a small movement, but Martin noticed. Your Honor, he said smoothly. To our understanding, Mr. Whitman left no legally acknowledged minor children from the current marriage. Margaret did not look at him. That is correct regarding the current marriage. The judge lifted her eyes. That was not my question. Hey. Thin silence spread across the courtroom. Humans do love hiding behind technically correct sentences, as though truth has never heard of side doors. Judge Brooks turned another page. The file indicates notice was also issued to Claire Whitman and 2 minor children, Ethan Whitman and Emily Whitman. Are they present? Vanessa felt heat rise beneath her pearls. Martin shifted slightly beside her. Your Honor, my client does not concede any estate relevance to those individuals at this time. Margaret finally turned her head, and her expression was neither sharp nor soft. It was worse. It was patient. They are relevant, she said, and they are expected. As if summoned by the sentence itself, the courtroom doors opened behind them. No one spoke. Even the old ventilation system seemed to lower its voice. Claire Whitman stepped inside wearing a simple black dress and a gray coat still dotted with rain. She did not look glamorous. She did not look defeated either. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her face pale from the drive, her eyes steady in a way that made Vanessa suddenly aware of how much effort her own composure required. On Claire's left stood Ethan, small and serious in a navy sweater, one hand gripping his mother's. On her right stood Emily, wearing a dark green cardigan and polished shoes, her chin lifted with a stubborn courage that did not belong to childhood and yet somehow lived there. The twins looked across the room, and in that instant the air changed. Caroline Whitman's hand flew to her mouth. One of the executives stared as if memory had taken human form. Even Martin Keller stopped writing. Ethan had Richard's blue eyes, the same unsettling shade that seemed to examine people before trusting them. Emily had Richard's brow, Richard's mouth, Richard's way of looking displeased with a room that had disappointed her. Vanessa saw it too. She hated that she saw it. Claire walked forward slowly, not with drama, not with anger, but with the unbearable dignity of a woman who had been absent only because powerful people had preferred her that way. Margaret pulled out the chair beside her. Mrs. Whitman, she said gently, then corrected herself with care. Claire, thank you for coming. Vanessa heard the correction and almost smiled, but the smile did not form. Judge Brooks looked at the children, then at Claire. You may be seated. Claire guided Ethan and Emily into the row behind counsel, placing herself between them and the rest of the room like a wall built from flesh, exhaustion, and years of practice. Vanessa turned halfway in her seat, her voice low but clear enough for those nearest to hear. This is unnecessary. Claire looked at her for the first time. There was no hatred in her face. That somehow made it worse. So was pretending they did not exist, she said. The courtroom did not gasp. Real life rarely has the courtesy to provide sound effects. But the silence that followed was louder than any reaction Vanessa could have imagined. Vanessa recovered first because people who build their lives on performance learn to mistake speed for strength. She turned fully toward Claire, letting her gaze pass over the children with a softness so artificial it might as well have come with a receipt. "Claire," she said, her voice low and polished, "I am sorry for your loss. But this is not the place to confuse old pain with legal standing." Claire did not answer immediately. She took Emily's hand from where it had curled into the sleeve of her coat and gently folded it between both of her own. Ethan sat perfectly still beside her, his small shoulders squared, trying to behave like a man in a room where the adults had already failed at decency. Margaret Hayes rose before Claire had to. "Your Honor, Miss Cole is not in a position to determine standing before the court." Martin Keller stood as well, all controlled irritation and expensive tailoring. "Your Honor, no one is denying that emotions may be involved. However, Mr. Whitman's estate should not be delayed by claims that were never fully adjudicated during his lifetime." "Claims," Claire repeated quietly. The word landed with such calm force that even Martin looked at her. Vanessa gave a faint smile. "Use when they want the knife hidden inside the napkin." Caroline Whitman made a small sound from across the aisle, but Vanessa continued, encouraged by the absence of immediate correction. "For years, Richard provided what he was legally advised to provide. If there were questions, they should have been settled then. Bringing children into a courtroom now, after his death, seems deeply unfortunate." Claire's face changed only slightly, but Margaret saw it. Not anger, not embarrassment, something colder and older than both. A mother calculating how much ugliness her children had just been asked to absorb. Judge Brooks lifted one hand. "Miss Cole, I would advise restraint." Vanessa lowered her eyes. "Yes, Your Honor." But she had already done what she intended to do. She had placed doubt into the room. She had suggested Claire was opportunistic, suggested the twins were uncertain, suggested Richard's silence had been evidence rather than cowardice. Humans have always had a remarkable talent for turning abandonment into paperwork and then acting surprised when the abandoned bring receipts. Claire reached into the worn leather tote at her feet and removed a folder. It was not elegant like Margaret's. It was brown, soft at the edges, held together with a rubber band. She stood slowly. "Your Honor, I did not come here to argue with Miss Cole. I came because Mr. Whitman's attorney asked me to bring my children." Her voice trembled once on the word children, then steadied. "But since their existence has been described as a claim, I would like the record to show that Ethan Richard Whitman and Emily Grace Whitman were born on March 12th at St. Anne's Medical Center in Providence. Richard Whitman was listed as their father on both birth certificates." Margaret accepted the documents and handed copies to the clerk. Martin stepped forward, a blue disposable gown, one hand pressed against the window, looking younger, frightened, and unmistakably present. Caroline began to cry silently. Vanessa did not look at her. She looked only at the photograph, and for the first time that morning, her confidence showed a hairline crack. "That proves he visited a hospital," Martin said, though his voice had lost some of its shine. Claire opened the folder again. "There are canceled checks for pediatric insurance premiums paid from Richard's personal account for 18 months. There are birthday cards in his handwriting. There are emails from his assistant scheduling visits he later canceled. There are photographs. There are school emergency forms. There are 7 years of small proofs, because when powerful people deny obvious truths, ordinary people learn to save everything." Judge Brooks leaned back slightly, studying Claire with new attention. "Ms. Hayes, is the estate prepared to address paternity today?" Margaret placed her hand on the sealed envelope in front of her. "Yes, Your Honor." Mr. Whitman anticipated this objection. Vanessa turned sharply toward Martin. He did not meet her eyes. The room seemed to narrow around the envelope. Ethan whispered, "Mom?" Claire sat down and placed a steady hand over his. Vanessa sat perfectly still, but the pearl strand at her throat moved with each shallow breath. Martin Keller leaned toward her and whispered something, probably wise, probably expensive, probably useless. Margaret Hayes waited while the clerk unfolded the documents and handed them to Judge Brooks. No one looked at Richard's portrait because there was no portrait in the courtroom, no polished version of him to soften what he had done. There were only records now, and records had a rude habit of being less sentimental than funerals. Judge Brooks read in silence first. Her eyes moved from the first page to the second, then back to the top as if confirming that the truth had indeed arrived in the correct format. Claire kept one hand on Ethan's shoulder and the other around Emily's fingers. She could feel Emily trembling, not with fear exactly, but with the terrible alertness of a child who knows adults are discussing her life in words too large to fit inside her chest. Ethan stared at the judge, trying not to blink. He had asked Claire once whether his father forgot them by accident. Claire had told him adults sometimes make wrong choices for a long time before they learn how wrong they were. It had been the gentlest answer she could give, though not the truest. Judge Brooks looked up. The laboratory report submitted to the estate and now entered into the record states that Richard Allen Whitman is the biological father of Ethan Richard Whitman and Emily Grace Whitman, with a probability exceeding 99.9%. The words did not explode. They settled. That was worse. They settled onto the benches, onto the polished table, onto Vanessa's black dress, onto every person who had ever found it convenient to pretend Claire had invented her own history. Caroline Whitman bowed her head and covered her eyes. One of the executives from Whitman Logistics looked down at his shoes with the sudden fascination of a man discovering moral courage a decade too late. Vanessa's lips tightened. "Richard never told me," she said, and for the first time that morning her voice lost its shine. Margaret turned toward her. "Richard did not tell many people many things." Martin stood. "Your Honor, while the report may establish biological paternity, the estate distribution still depends on the controlling testamentary documents." "That is correct," Judge Brooks said. "Ms. Hayes, proceed." Margaret opened her leather folder and removed a second document, thicker than the first, bound with a blue backing and stamped by a notary. Vanessa saw it and went very still. People often fear the paper they do not recognize. Sensible, really, since civilization has apparently decided lives can be reorganized by signatures and staples. 3 weeks before his death, Margaret said, Mr. Whitman executed a revised family trust and a codicil to his will. He did so after receiving the paternity results and after meeting with me privately on 2 occasions. Vanessa turned to Martin, her eyes sharp with accusation. "You said the documents were updated after our marriage." Martin's face remained controlled, but his silence betrayed him. "They were," Margaret said, "and then they were updated again." Claire closed her eyes for 1 second. Not in relief. Relief was too simple. What moved through her was grief wearing a new coat, grief for the years Richard had wasted, for the birthdays he had missed, for the school plays where Ethan had searched the doorway, for the father-daughter breakfast where Emily had brought Claire instead and insisted it was better that way. The DNA report did not give those years back. It only proved they had been stolen with full knowledge of what they were worth. Judge Brooks adjusted the document before her. "Before the court reviews the financial provisions, I will note for the record that Ethan and Emily Whitman are legal heirs for the purpose of this proceeding." Emily leaned closer to Claire. "Does that mean he knew us?" she whispered. Claire's throat tightened so hard it hurt. She bent toward her daughter and answered softly, "It means he knew who you were." It was not the answer Emily deserved, but it was the only one Claire could safely give in a room full of people who had already turned childhood into evidence. Margaret continued, her voice steady but not cold. "Mr. Whitman also left a handwritten statement to be read only after the children's status was established." Vanessa's head snapped up. "A statement?" Judge Brooks looked at Margaret. "Read it." Margaret unfolded one final page. The handwriting was Richard's, sharp and slanted, still trying to outrun consequence even from the grave. "I spent years allowing silence to protect my comfort. Ethan and Emily are my children." Claire did not lie. She did not exaggerate. She carried the burden of my absence with more grace than I deserved. If there is one decent thing left for my name to do, it is to shelter them now. Claire stared at the table until the words blurred. She did not cry, not because she was untouched, but because some tears are too old to fall when summoned. Vanessa, however, had gone pale beneath her careful makeup, because she understood before anyone read the next page that Richard had not merely confessed. He had planned. Margaret did not begin with the mansion, which surprised Vanessa more than it should have. People like Vanessa expected money to announce itself first, wearing marble steps and ocean views and bank balances with too many zeros. Margaret began instead with the trust. Under the revised Whitman Family Trust, executed and notarized on October 3rd, Richard Allen Whitman transfers 70% of his voting shares in Whitman Logistics into an irrevocable trust for the benefit of Ethan Richard Whitman and Emily Grace Whitman. The room did not move, but something in it seemed to drop several floors. One of the executives inhaled sharply. Caroline whispered, "Richard, not as a prayer, not as forgiveness, but as the tired sound of a woman realizing her brother had waited until the final hallway of his life to do one decent thing." Vanessa turned toward Martin, but his eyes were on the document now, scanning the copy Margaret had handed across the table. His face had become unreadable in the way attorneys prefer when the ship is already taking on water and everyone is pretending the carpet is only damp. Judge Brooks leaned forward. "Continue." Margaret turned the page. "The trust shall be administered by Claire Whitman as trustee until both beneficiaries reach the age of 25. During that period, Ms. Whitman is authorized to make distributions for housing, education, medical care, counseling, reasonable living expenses, and any other needs connected to the children's welfare." Vanessa's mouth opened slightly. "Claire controls the trust?" The sentence slipped out before Martin could stop her. Judge Brooks looked over her glasses. "Ms. Cole, your attorney may speak for you." Vanessa pressed her lips together, but the damage was done. Everyone had heard what frightened her. Not the children's pain. Not Richard's confession. Control. That tiny human god people worship right up until it abandons them in a public building with fluorescent lights. Margaret continued without looking at her. "The Greenwich residence shall remain within the trust as a protected family property. It may not be sold, mortgaged, leased, transferred, or otherwise encumbered without court approval while either beneficiary is a minor." Vanessa's fingers tightened around her handbag until the leather creaked softly. The house. The 8-bedroom house with the rose garden, the heated floors, the library she had planned to redecorate because Richard's first wife had chosen the shelves. The house she had walked through that very morning as though the walls had already learned her name. Margaret turned another page. "The Nantucket property is to be sold, with proceeds divided equally between educational accounts for Ethan and Emily. All personal items belonging to the children or connected to their birth, including photographs, letters, and medical records in Mr. Whitman's possession, are to be released to Claire Whitman within 30 days. Claire lowered her eyes. That almost broke her more than the shares, more than the house, more than every number spoken aloud. Somewhere, Richard had kept things. Not enough, never enough, not a substitute for bedtime stories or scrape-knee comfort or showing up when a school choir sang off-key in a cafeteria smelling of pizza. But things. Proof that memory had existed in him even when courage had not. Ethan leaned against her side. Emily stared at Margaret as if the woman were reading a map out of a locked room. Martin rose slowly. "Your Honor, we will need time to review the validity of these documents, especially given the proximity to Mr. Whitman's death." Margaret nodded once. Mr. Whitman anticipated that as well. Vanessa went still again. That phrase had become a door she dreaded hearing open. Margaret lifted the final page. "There is a no contest clause applying specifically to Vanessa Cole Whitman. Mrs. Whitman is granted the Riverside condominium in Stamford, personal jewelry gifted to her during the marriage, and a cash distribution of $2 million, provided she does not challenge the paternity of Ethan and Emily Whitman, challenge the trust, initiate defamatory public statements regarding Claire Whitman or the minor children, interfere with trust property, or attempt unauthorized contact with the beneficiaries." The courtroom absorbed the words in stunned layers. $2 million would have changed most lives. In Vanessa's face, it landed like an insult. She had not wanted comfort. She had wanted the throne. Judge Brooks took the document and read the clause herself, while Martin sat down with the careful heaviness of a man whose strategy had just been reduced to damage control. "The clause appears specific," the judge said. "This court will allow counsel time for formal review, but absent evidence of incapacity, coercion, or procedural defect, the documents will stand provisionally pending certification." Vanessa's voice came out thin. "He promised me security." Claire looked at her then, not triumphantly, not cruelly, simply with the exhausted clarity of someone who had learned that promises were not food, shelter, or fatherhood. "He promised a lot of people things," Claire said. Vanessa stared at the children, and for one brief second her polished expression cracked into something rawer, not sorrow, not remorse, but disbelief that the story had continued without obeying her. Emily slipped her hand into Ethan's. Ethan lifted his chin. Margaret placed Richard's statement back into the folder, and the blue-back trust documents lay on the table, like a new border drawn through everyone's future. The kingdom Vanessa had imagined receiving whole had been divided by names she thought had been buried under silence, and those names now sat 3 feet behind her, wearing school shoes and holding their mother's hands. Judge Brooks called a 15-minute recess after the provisional ruling, perhaps because even courts, those temples of organized human disappointment, occasionally recognize when a room needs to breathe. No one moved at first. Vanessa remained seated with her handbag clutched in both hands, staring at the trust documents as if enough disbelief might rearrange the ink. Martin Keller leaned toward her and spoke in a low voice, but she seemed not to hear him. Across the aisle, Caroline Whitman stood slowly and walked toward Claire with the stiff uncertainty of someone approaching a bridge she had helped burn. Claire rose because manners, unlike money, had never abandoned her completely. Caroline looked at Ethan, then Emily, and her face crumpled into an expression too honest to be useful. "I am sorry," she said. 3 words. Late by 7 years. Small against everything. Still, Claire understood that some apologies arrive carrying no solution, only evidence that the person saying them has finally stopped lying to herself. "Thank you," Claire replied, because she had children watching, and children learn dignity from the moments when adults would rather choose bitterness. Caroline bent slightly toward the twins. "I am your Aunt Caroline." Ethan looked at his mother first. Emily did too. That nearly undid Claire. The twins had learned to ask permission before trusting blood, a skill no child should need, and yet here humanity was, handing out emotional paperwork before breakfast. Claire nodded once. Ethan said, "Hello." Emily whispered it after him. Caroline covered her mouth again and stepped back, not forcing more, which was the first wise thing Claire had seen anyone in Richard's family do all morning. Vanessa stood then, her chair scraping softly against the floor. The sound made Emily flinch, and Claire felt it through their joined hands. Vanessa noticed. For 1 second, something like shame crossed her face, quick and unwelcome. Then pride returned, because pride is often the last furniture left in a collapsing house. "You must feel very satisfied," Vanessa said to Claire, her voice controlled but thin. Claire looked at her carefully. Here was the woman who had smiled beside Richard's casket, who had entered the courtroom expecting a coronation, who had spoken of Claire's children as if they were an inconvenience filed in the wrong cabinet. It would have been easy to answer sharply. It would have been human. Unfortunately, humans have already tried easy for several thousand years, and the results are lying around everywhere. Claire chose something harder. "No," she said. "Satisfied is not the word for finding out my children mattered to their father only after he was gone." Vanessa blinked. The sentence reached places accusation could not have reached. Martin touched Vanessa's elbow, but she pulled away gently and looked past Claire toward Ethan and Emily. "I did not know about the test," she said. It was not an apology. It was not enough. But it was the first sentence she had spoken that did not sound rehearsed. Claire did not rescue her from it. "Now you do," she said. Margaret Hayes returned to the council table and gathered the documents with the neat hands of a woman who had seen fortunes divided and still believed the smallest truths mattered most. Judge Brooks re-entered, and everyone rose again. The court set dates for final certification, ordered preservation of all estate assets, restricted access to the Greenwich residence pending inventory, and instructed both parties to communicate only through counsel regarding the children. Each order fell into place like locks turning. Vanessa sat down slowly as the future she had imagined became smaller, still comfortable by any reasonable American standard, but no longer royal. $2 million, a condominium, and silence. A tragic fate, naturally, if one has confused luxury with oxygen. When the hearing ended, Claire helped the twins into their coats. Ethan asked whether they had to live in the big house. "Not today," Claire said. "Maybe not ever. A house is only good if it feels safe." Emily touched the edge of the folder Margaret had given Claire, the copies of the documents that carried their names. "Did Dad love us?" she asked. The question was so quiet that only Claire heard it. She knelt in the courthouse hallway, ignoring the people passing around them, ignoring Vanessa standing 20 feet away with her pearls and her ruined certainty. Claire placed one hand on each child's cheek. "Your father made choices I will never be able to explain for him," she said softly. "But today he told the truth. And the truth is that you belong. You always belonged." Ethan's eyes filled, but he did not cry. Emily leaned forward into Claire's shoulder, and Claire held both children there under the flat courthouse lights, in a hallway that smelled of rain, old paper, and coffee from a vending machine that probably hated everyone equally. When Claire finally stood, Vanessa was watching them. No smile now. No victory. Just a woman forced to understand that inheritance was not only money, and losing was not always measured in dollars. Claire walked past her without lowering her eyes. Margaret opened the courthouse door, and cold November air swept in from the street. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky over Greenwich was still gray, but along the edge of the clouds, a thin line of sunlight had begun to show. Claire took Ethan's hand, then Emily's, and stepped into it without looking back. The drive back to Providence took nearly 2 hours, though to Claire it felt less like distance than a slow return from one life into another. The twins were quiet in the back seat, each holding a juice box Margaret had produced from her oversized tote, with the mysterious preparedness of older women who have seen enough family disasters to pack for them. Ethan watched the wet highway slide past his window. Emily held the folder on her lap, as if it were a sleeping animal she had been trusted not to wake. Claire kept both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, but her mind kept returning to the courthouse hallway, to Vanessa's face when the trust was read, to Richard's handwriting turning 7 years of silence into one late confession. She had imagined, more times than she would ever admit, what it might feel like for the truth to finally stand in public. She had thought it would feel clean, triumphant maybe. Instead it felt complicated, like opening a window in a house that had been closed for too long and discovering the air outside was cold. By the time they reached their apartment, the rain had returned in a soft gray mist. The hallway light flickered as usual. Mrs. Alvarez from downstairs opened her door just as Claire was unlocking hers, holding a laundry basket against her hip. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked, because in old buildings neighbors either know too much or not enough, and somehow both are considered community. Claire nodded, then realized she was too tired to make the lie graceful. "Better than yesterday," she said. Mrs. Alvarez looked at the twins, then at the folder in Emily's hands, and softened. "Then that is enough for today." Inside, the apartment seemed smaller than it had that morning, but not lesser. The radiator clanked. The kitchen sink held 2 cereal bowls Claire had forgotten to wash. Emily kicked off her polished shoes and immediately changed into fuzzy socks with yellow stars. Ethan placed his sweater carefully over the back of a chair, then stood in the middle of the living room like a visitor waiting to be told where he belonged. Claire saw it and hated Richard for that most of all, not for the money, not for the house, not even for Vanessa. She hated him for making belonging feel like a question her children had to ask silently. She set the courthouse folder on the kitchen table and said, "Pizza tonight." Emily looked up. "From the place with garlic knots." "From the place with garlic knots." Ethan frowned slightly. "Can we afford that?" There it was, the tiny arithmetic of childhood under pressure. Claire crossed the room and knelt before him. "Yes," she said, "and you do not have to worry about that tonight." His face did not fully relax, but something in his shoulders loosened. "Do we have to tell people at school?" "Only what you want to tell," Claire said. "Your story belongs to you." Emily climbed onto the couch and pulled a blanket around her knees. "Will we see the big house?" Claire looked toward the window, where rain streaked the glass and turned the streetlights blurry. The Greenwich mansion rose in her memory, all limestone, perfect hedges, and rooms so quiet they had once made her feel like she should apologize for breathing. "Maybe someday," she said. "But a house does not become home because a paper says your name." Manageable tragedy. Ethan brought home a science worksheet about weather patterns and asked whether storms knew where they were going. Claire said no, then wondered whether that made storms luckier than people. The estate moved through its procedures with the slow dignity of an old machine that had no interest in anyone's feelings. Margaret called twice a week. The court appointed an independent inventory specialist. The trust accountant requested records. The school counselor met with the twins separately and told Claire they were bright, guarded, and trying very hard to protect her, which made Claire sit in her car afterward for 15 minutes with both hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the kind of sadness that has no convenient category. Vanessa did not contest the trust. Martin Keller filed a narrow request for clarification, received an answer from Judge Brooks that was polite enough to qualify as surgical, and withdrew. The no contest clause had done its work. Money often behaves like morality once consequences are attached to it. Another cheerful little indictment of civilization. When Claire finally drove through the iron gates of the Whitman property, Ethan and Emily were not with her. She had left them with Mrs. Alvarez for the afternoon, eating grilled cheese sandwiches and watching cartoons, because children did not need to witness every room where their mother had once disappeared. The mansion looked exactly as she remembered and nothing like memory. Gray stone walls, black shutters, 6 chimneys, a circular driveway lined with bare November trees. The rose garden had been cut back for winter, its branches thorny and dark against the wet soil. Margaret waited on the front steps in a camel coat, holding a clipboard. Beside her stood a locksmith, the inventory specialist, and Caroline Whitman, who looked smaller in daylight than she had in court. "You do not have to do this today," Margaret said as Claire stepped from the car. Claire looked up at the house. The last time she had left it, Emily had been asleep in a car seat. Ethan had been crying because his stuffed rabbit was somewhere inside, and Richard had stood in the doorway saying they would discuss visitation once emotions settled down. Emotions, apparently, had taken 7 years and a probate hearing to settle. "I know," Claire said, "but I want to see what is here." The front door opened with a heavy click. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and cold stone. Vanessa's floral perfume still lingered somewhere beneath it, thin but persistent, like an opinion no one had requested. Claire walked past the staircase where she had once posed for holiday photographs, past the dining room where Richard had toasted investors while she refilled water glasses because the caterer was short-staffed, past the sitting room Vanessa had redecorated in pale blue velvet. The inventory specialist spoke quietly into a recorder. Margaret took notes. Caroline followed at a respectful distance. In the library, Claire stopped. The shelves were the same dark walnut she had chosen before the company became large enough to hire designers. Richard had wanted glass and steel. Claire had wanted wood, warmth, a room where books looked touched instead of displayed. Vanessa had changed the rugs and lamps, but the shelves remained. On the lower shelf near the desk sat a small cardboard box labeled in Richard's handwriting, E&E. Claire stared at it until Margaret gently asked, "Would you like me to open it?" Claire shook her head and knelt. Inside were things that should have lived in her apartment all along. A hospital bracelet, 2 birthday cards never mailed, a small blue knit hat Ethan had worn in the neonatal unit, a photograph of Emily asleep against Claire's shoulder, taken before Claire knew Richard had entered the room. Beneath them was a drawing, crayon on construction paper, sent years ago and never acknowledged. Emily had drawn 4 stick figures in front of a red-doored house. Claire remembered mailing it after Emily asked whether Daddy might like a picture. Richard had kept it. He had kept it and still not come. That was the part that made Claire press her hand against the desk until the room steadied. Caroline moved closer, but did not touch her. Good. Some grief should not be patted like a nervous dog. Claire placed the drawing back in the box with careful fingers. "These go home with us," she said. Margaret nodded. They belonged to the children. Claire stood and looked around the library, at the house that was now protected for Ethan and Emily, at the walls that had watched her become invisible and now had the nerve to stand there quietly, as if stone had no memory. She did not feel victorious. She felt awake. "Change every lock," she told the locksmith. "Inventory everything. Nothing leaves this property without court approval." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Caroline looked at her then with something like respect and maybe a little fear. Claire picked up the box marked E&E and held it against her chest. For the first time since she had crossed that threshold years ago with 2 babies and nowhere certain to go, the house did not feel like the place that had rejected her. It felt like a building. Just a building. And buildings, unlike people, could be repaired, sold, locked, opened, or left behind. The first Saturday of December arrived clear and cold, with a pale sun hanging over Providence like it had been placed there out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. Claire woke before the twins, made coffee, packed the small cardboard box from the Greenwich Library into a canvas tote, and sat for a long time at the kitchen table watching steam rise from her mug. The apartment was quiet in a way that no longer felt like fear. On the refrigerator, Emily had taped a new drawing. 3 people standing in front of a red-doored house. Except this time the house was smaller, with flower pots by the steps and a crooked chimney puffing cheerful smoke into a purple sky. Ethan had written their names underneath in careful block letters. Mom, Ethan, Emily. There was no blank space where Richard should have been. Claire did not know whether that was healing or simply a child's honest accounting, but she decided not to correct it. After breakfast, she told them they were going for a drive. To the big house. Ethan asked. Claire nodded. Just to see it. Not to decide anything. Emily put on her green cardigan, the same one she had worn to court, as if courage were an outfit that could be reused. The trip to Greenwich was quieter this time. No legal envelope waited at the end of it. No courtroom. No Vanessa and pearls. Just a house, a trust, and the strange question of what to do with something inherited from a man who had given too little too late. When Claire turned through the iron gates, Emily pressed her face to the window. It looks like a museum, she said. Ethan frowned. Do people live in museums? Some people try, Claire said, but it usually makes them weird. That earned the smallest laugh from the back seat, and Claire accepted it like a gift. The new locks clicked open beneath Claire's hand. Inside, the mansion was cold despite the heat being on, because some houses apparently specialize in emotional weather. The twins stepped into the foyer and looked around with wide, uncertain eyes. Claire did not rush them. She let them walk through the rooms, touching nothing at first, then slowly touching everything a child might use to understand scale. The banister, the edge of a marble table, the brass knob on the library door. In the library, Claire set the cardboard box on Richard's old desk. These were yours, she said. Emily opened it first. Ethan stood close beside her. They lifted out the hospital bracelet, the blue knit hat, the birthday cards, the photograph, the crayon drawing. Ethan stared at the cards. Why did he not send them? Claire sat on the edge of the leather chair Richard had once treated like a throne. I do not know, she said. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he thought keeping them was easier than facing what he had missed. Ethan looked down at the card in his hand. That is not a good reason. No, Claire said. It is not. Emily held up the drawing of the red-doored house she had made years earlier. I remember this, she whispered. I wanted him to know our door was red in my picture. Claire swallowed carefully. He knew. Emily considered that, then placed the drawing back in the box with surprising gentleness. Can we take it home? Yes. Not leave it here. No, Claire said. Not leave it here. They spent 1 hour in the house. No more. Claire showed them the garden, the kitchen, the room that had once been prepared as a nursery before Richard decided the twins should visit later, when things were less complicated. Things, naturally, had been made complicated by adults and then blamed on timing, because blaming clocks is apparently more comfortable than blaming choices. Before they left, Claire stood with the children on the back terrace overlooking the winter lawn. This house belongs to the trust, she said. That means it is protected for you. But protected does not mean required. We can sell it someday with the court's permission. We can keep it. We can turn it into something useful. We do not have to decide now. Ethan slipped his hand into hers. I do not want to live here. Emily shook her head. Me neither. It is too quiet. Claire looked at the stone walls, the tall windows, the expensive silence. For years, she had thought justice would mean returning to this place and finally feeling chosen. But standing there with her children, she understood something cleaner. Justice was not being invited back into a house that had once made her small. Justice was having the right to walk away without losing anything that mattered. Then we go home, she said. That evening, back in Providence, they ordered Chinese food, spread the documents across the kitchen table after the twins went to bed, and Claire signed the first papers to open their education accounts. She placed Richard's statement in a file, not in the box with the children's things. His regret belonged to the legal record. Their memories belonged to them. Months later, the Greenwich house would be leased to a children's literacy foundation with court approval. Its library opened on weekends for tutoring and reading programs. Vanessa would move to Stamford, silent by necessity or calculation, which sometimes look identical from a distance. Caroline would send birthday cards, and Claire would let the twins decide when to answer. Life did not become perfect. It became steadier, which is less glamorous and far more useful. On the twins' 8th birthday, Claire watched Ethan and Emily blow out candles in their small apartment, while Mrs. Alvarez clapped off beat and frosting somehow appeared on the wall. Because joy, like children, respects no surface. Claire looked at their faces in the candlelight and thought of the courtroom, The envelope, the house, the woman in pearls, the man who had waited until the end to tell a truth he should have lived. Then Emily leaned against her side, and Ethan reached for her hand, and Claire understood the final lesson Richard had accidentally left behind. A name can be restored by law. Money can be protected by trust. A house can be locked, inventoried, and repurposed. But a family is rebuilt in smaller ways, at kitchen tables, in bedtime answers, in showing up every ordinary morning until children no longer wonder whether they belong. Claire had not won because Vanessa lost. She had won because Ethan and Emily would grow up knowing silence was not the same as truth, absence was not the same as worth, and no one, not even a father with an empire, had the right to make them feel like shadows in their own story. By spring, the Whitman house no longer looked like a monument to Richard's mistakes. The Children's Literacy Foundation had moved in slowly, first with folding tables and donated books, then with bright rugs, low shelves, beanbags, bulletin boards, and a ridiculous papier-mâché dragon named Sir Reads a Lot because adults, when supervised by children, occasionally become useful. The library Claire had once chosen in another lifetime became the heart of it. On Saturday mornings, tutors helped second graders sound out sentences beneath the same walnut shelves where Richard had hidden the box marked E and E. In the dining room, volunteers served juice boxes and peanut butter sandwiches where investors had once discussed quarterly growth. The formal sitting room, which had always seemed designed to make breathing feel impolite, became a story circle. Children sat cross-legged on the floor while college students read aloud, and their laughter rose up toward the chandelier with absolutely no respect for old money acoustics. Claire visited once a month as trustee, usually with Ethan and Emily, who had decided the house was less frightening when filled with children who spilled crackers and asked blunt questions. Emily liked the art corner by the tall windows. Ethan liked the old globe in the library, which he spun with intense seriousness before choosing countries he planned to visit when he became, depending on the week, an architect, a marine biologist, or the owner of a pizza restaurant with scholarships. Claire never corrected the contradictions. Ambition was allowed to be messy now. One Saturday in April, after the Foundation's open house, Caroline arrived with a small gift bag and an expression that still carried more apology than confidence. She had been trying, carefully, awkwardly, which is usually the only honest way people begin repairing what pride helped ruin. She sent birthday cards without demands. She asked before visiting. She never mentioned Richard as if he were a saint temporarily misunderstood by paperwork. That helped. The gift bag held 2 framed photographs from Richard's childhood, one of him at 8 years old missing both front teeth, and one of him standing beside Caroline at a beach in Maine, squinting into the sun. Ethan studied the first picture for a long time. "He looks like me," he said. Claire waited for pain to enter the sentence, but it did not. It was only observation. Maybe that was progress, the kind that arrives quietly because healing has better manners than drama. Emily took the second photograph and said, "Can we keep these at home, but not in our rooms?" Claire nodded. "That sounds fair." Caroline's eyes watered, but she did not make the moment about herself, another small miracle from the species that invented family court and then acted surprised it was needed. Later, when the open house ended and the volunteers began stacking chairs, Claire walked through the garden alone. New buds had appeared on the rose bushes. The air smelled of damp soil and cut grass. She stopped near the terrace where she had once stood with the twins, deciding not to live in a house that had taken too much from her. Now she could hear children laughing through the open library windows. The sound changed the property more than money ever had. Margaret Hayes joined her, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the refreshment table. "You did something good with it," Margaret said. Claire accepted the cup. The house needed better ghosts. Margaret smiled slightly. "Most houses do." Claire looked back at the windows. For a long time, she had measured justice by what was returned: names, documents, assets, recognition. Those things mattered. They mattered deeply. A child's future should not depend on whether adults feel brave enough to admit the truth. But justice, she had learned, was not only restoration. Sometimes it was transformation. It was taking a place built around silence and filling it with voices. It was taking money used to control a story and using it to open doors for children whose names Richard would never know. It was refusing to let bitterness become the family inheritance. That evening, Back in Providence, Ethan and Emily taped the new photographs inside the family memory box, not on the lid, not on display, but inside with the other complicated things. Then Emily added a new drawing. The big house with its red library door, dozens of children in the windows, and Claire standing outside holding two hands. At the top she wrote, in uneven purple marker, "Our story changed." Claire placed the drawing carefully in the box and closed the lid. She did not feel the old ache sharpen. She felt something softer, not forgiveness exactly, not forgetfulness, and certainly not the sugary nonsense people sell when they want wounded women to become convenient again. She felt free. Richard's name would remain in legal documents, trust papers, and old photographs. Vanessa's smile would remain in memory as a warning about crowns made from other people's erasure. But Ethan and Emily would remember something larger. They would remember a mother who walked into court when she was afraid. They would remember that truth can arrive late and still matter. They would remember that dignity does not need applause to be powerful. And years from now, when they asked where their story truly began, Claire would not point to the funeral, the courtroom, the mansion, or the will. She would point to the ordinary kitchen table in Providence, where three people kept choosing one another every morning until belonging no longer had to be proven.